My name is Dr. Samir Kakodkar. I am a gastroenterologist and also a specialist in ulcerative colitis and Crohn's disease. Welcome to Against the Grain. If you find these podcasts valuable, please do subscribe. You can find all of my previous episodes at the website samir3.podomatic.com or search my first and last name into the podcast app on your iPhone. All podcasts are free and I have no conflicts of interest to report. If you want to reach out to me, you can send an email to samir3@gmail.com. That's SAMIR3@gmail.com. Dr. Jack Kruse is a practicing neurosurgeon with a strong interest in quantum biology, specifically the importance of the light environment, circadian rhythm, and mitochondria in relation to health and disease. In my opinion, these are topics that require more attention and research in the context of Crohn's disease and ulcerative colitis. This is one of the most high-level podcasts I have ever recorded, as Dr. Kruse's knowledge base regarding these topics is unparalleled. You will hear things in this interview that will make you rethink some of your assumptions. We overall need to do this more often for there to be progress in the treatment of IBD. So resist the temptation to immediately disbelieve or even believe everything that we discussed, but actually go into the literature. See for yourself if Dr. Kruse is right. I did this myself on some of these topics, and the information did seem consistent. As a disclaimer, nothing in this podcast should be interpreted as medical advice from my perspective. None of these interventions have been investigated in the context of clinical trials to determine if they actually affect clinical outcomes. Also, increasing sun exposure with IBD, especially while on certain immunosuppressive medications and biologics, comes with the possible risk of skin cancer, although I realize the controversy surrounding this issue, which we do discuss in the podcast. Dr. Kruse, thank you for making time for this interview. I felt like the IBD community, Crohn's and colitis patients, clinicians, particularly researchers, need to hear your unique perspective. I can say that when I first discovered your work, it was like the scene in The Matrix when Neo meets Morpheus and finds out how deep the rabbit hole goes. This moment where I had to say, like, whoa, this is medicine at another level, and specifically a subatomic and quantum level. So I just really appreciate your ability to synthesize the cutting-edge basic science research regarding circadian rhythm and mitochondria, bring it all together. It's just a really remarkable thing, and I think some of the newer research that's coming out is really catching up to some of the theories you had years ago. So I thought just to start out, can you briefly just tell us about your background and training and what made you transition into what you're doing now?
Well, my background and training, the way I first started out, I was actually an All-American football player and baseball player in college, wound up becoming a dentist, became an oral surgeon, went to med school, then got into neurosurgery. In neurosurgery, I predominantly was a spine specialist doing complex spine and minimally invasive spine. And what brought me to where I am today, because I consider myself, a theoretical quantum biologist now. That's really my passion. I'm still practicing neurosurgery, but the way I practice has radically changed in the last 15 years. And what changed me is, as you probably know as a gastroenterologist, neurosurgeons are up pretty much all night. Mm-hmm. And when I was up all night for 25 years, taking call every other night, I got to be about 360 pounds. And of course, in medicine, in allopathic medicine, we tell patients, eat less, exercise more. I did that and I gained 30 more pounds. So I started to think about that axiom that Einstein talked about. If you keep doing the same thing over and over again and you expect a different result, that's called insanity. So one day, a fortunate event happened to me. I was giving a talk in Alabama to spine surgeons about a device that I had invented. And I just stood up to go to the podium, and I tore my knee meniscus, could barely walk. One of the orthopedic surgeon's wives was in the audience, and she happened to work for a biotechnology company. And she told me, look, I think I know why this happened to you. My husband says you're a smart guy. I'm going to send you this book and the 6 papers, and I think you'll figure out what's kind of going on. And what she was basically trying to tell me is the company she was working for was kind of cooking the books on this new hormone that had been discovered in the late 90s, early 2000s, which was called leptin. And when I went through the stuff that she sent me, I completely went a different way. I started to realize that many of the things that I had been taught in medical school were incorrect, and many of the things that we believed about how the gut and brain work together in unison were completely incorrect. And in many facets, what we thought was important really wasn't important at all. For example, in your world as a gastroenterologist, the dominant paradigm still to this day is that food plays a big role. Some of the latest data out there from Jeff Leach and his papers that were published in Science challenge that in a big way. And I've been saying that for 15 years because it's how I figured out that blue light was the cause of my obesity and simplified my gut flora. And what I did is I used the central retinal pathways and my skin, as well as my gut surface, to actually sculpt my microbiome so that I could lose weight. And that's kind of how it went. And when I did it, came up with, 2 prescriptions that basically work around leptin and work around some other hormones in the body. I gave them the name called the leptin prescription, the cold thermogenesis protocol. I just put the information on the internet about 15 years ago, and voila, here we are today. I've got 3 million people that follow me, and I'm teaching people kind of what I learned, because this entire process that we just spoke about goes back to one of the key genomes in the body, and it's not the genome that you and I learned a lot about in medical school, which is the nuclear genome. It's actually the mitochondrial genome. And your mitochondria really control just about everything in your body. It controls the epigenetic program. It controls how the nuclear genes are expressed. It controls many of the hormones, that people know about in the microbiome and in the gut in terms of how it works. But the way in which it works, fundamentally, as you said in the introduction, comes down to the subatomic particles that are present in nature, meaning electrons, protons, and light, which is known as photons. And that's what people don't really know that much about, and that's kind of what I teach people, on my website and on my Patreon blog and through, podcasts like you're doing with me today.
Yeah, and I do want to get into some more detailed questions about all the aspects you just mentioned, but before we get into that, can you explain, I want to keep this podcast as focused on Crohn's and colitis as possible. So with respect to that, why do you believe people are getting Crohn's and colitis now, and the numbers are increasing all over the world now? So what do you think are the major inputs to seeing this manifest in so many places with so many people?
I think this one is easy. It's the easiest question you can ask me, is because people don't go outside. That's the number one reason. And what people don't realize is that the skin and then the gut secondary is the largest collection of B and T cells. B and T cells in the body control both arms of immunity in the body. They have to be programmed by diurnal frequency changes in sunlight. And the problem is, all biology, including human biology, but I'm talking about plant biology, has been completely dominated by the solar spectrum for 4.6 billion years. We know that life's been around for about 3.8 billion years. So you have to realize these cells are optimized on an evolutionary basis to the diurnal changes that have been present on the Earth in that time frame. Right now, for example, in humans that have these two conditions, the light that they're optimized is now LED light and fluorescent light. And that's the light that we've lived under predominantly since 1893, when Tesla came out with the AC power grid, and Edison and Tesla bulbs were innovated. People just don't realize the effect of light on biology. And when you really understand light the way I do, you begin to see pretty clearly why the difference between sunlight and man-made light, or what I call ALAN, which is artificial light at night. We also have artificial light during the day now. And most people that have those two conditions are extremely blue light toxic or toxic to other parts of the electromagnetic spectrum in their environment, either due to their work, how they live their life, the choices they make, because it malprograms the B and T cells in their body for the disease to manifest.
many patients are used to their physicians saying that food has nothing to do with Crohn's and colitis. I've done some research and some microbiome research with regard to certain diets and their effect in IBD, but you've said on prior talks, particularly with respect to obesity, that food has little to do with it, and as you mentioned, it's more about the light environment and also eating within season.
Right.
Does that statement also apply to Crohn's and colitis as well, where food has little to do with the disease process and it's more addressing the light environment?
Actually, I think food in those conditions does play a role, but it plays a role not in the way you ask the question or your intent. Mm-hmm. The link back is to photosynthesis. And remember, this is the big black box for gastroenterologists. They don't seem to realize that the entire food web on this planet is linked back to what? The sun. And everybody with this condition also doesn't seem to realize this. So when you hear what I said to you before about why I think these two diseases are related to a lack of UV and infrared A light, then you begin to understand, well, how does that key statement link then to food? And it does. It links to it in a big way. For example, carbohydrates are two foods that I would significantly limit in people that have this condition. And the reason why, when do carbohydrates grow? When UV light is the dominant light that's present in the environment. Well, if I just told you that these two diseases are because you're never in UV light, that means if your skin and eyes and gut never get the stimulus of UV light, you've got no business eating a banana when you have these conditions. Why? Because you basically just created a mismatch between your skin and eye and the gut mitochondria, and they can't handle those types of things. Now, when I say that food doesn't matter, I'm specifically speaking about someone who doesn't have any autoimmune conditions, someone who's relatively healthy, who doesn't have the problems in the microbiome that your patients normally would have.
Okay.
So in those two conditions, I do think they matter, but they matter within the light and water and magnetism context that no one speaks about for those conditions.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I am not aware of any research or clinical trials. Maybe they exist, but from the major conferences and IBD, nobody's talking about really eating within season, the effect of that. It's more on these kind of elimination diets. As a diet that's really popular, I'm not sure you've heard of, called a specific carbohydrate diet.
I've heard all of them. Trust me. I mean, the guys that came up with the specific carbohydrate diet had me on a podcast 10 years ago, and I kind of chuckled at them.
Right.
We just don't realize how light sculpts the microbiome. They don't realize how light really controls the gut. And the real issue with this is light is by far the most complicated thing in nature. There's no question about it, especially when you look at it from a physics standpoint. But when you look at it from a biologic standpoint, especially when you're a clinician, most doctors, as a gastroenterologist, you didn't learn anything about light except that it gets split into a rainbow because you saw it on a Pink Floyd album cover.
Right.
The key thing is that all those 7 colors do different things in the body, and it's incumbent upon us to realize how those things relate to the diseases we treat. And we do our patients a big disservice when we act like things that really do matter don't matter. And I have to tell you, sunlight and diet happen to be those two things. And it drives me absolutely crazy as a clinician when I talk to, especially your profession, because I have several members that are gastroenterologists who get my perspective. When I just tell people that single fact that every photosynthetic web links to the food web, how could it not be about light if that's the case? And this is axiomatically true, and it just drives me crazy when I hear people never make this link. And for somebody to say it needs to be studied, it doesn't need to be studied, my friend. The reason why is these are universal laws of nature. That means they're true on Earth, they're true on Jupiter, they're true on Betelgeuse. They're true everywhere. And they're not subject to a randomized controlled clinical trial. But yet, we think they are because our bias as clinicians, because we think the gold standard is RCTs. Listen, the photoelectric effect in food works universally. The problem is it's not applied to our populations because humans make choices to break nature's laws. They put light on that should not be present at the wrong time of the day. It's really that simple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I remember you made a statement about randomized controlled trials that one of the major issues with them, obviously besides the obvious that they can only test like most of the time one variable at a time, but also they don't control for light environment either.
Exactly. Look, everything that you learned about in medical school, because you learned the same things I did, every single trial in IBD and in any kind of Crohn's disease, it's always done in a lab. Let me ask you a question. What kind of light is in a lab? Is it sunlight or is it artificial light?
Right.
So maybe the reason why we're not getting the answers for the patients they need is because we're studying it under the wrong light. And it's pretty crystal clear right now that the microbiome reacts differently in different lights. And nobody in your world seems to get the message. Hopefully, eventually, as quantum biology takes over as the dominant paradigm in medicine, it's going to spill over into every different specialty, in all the different diseases we treat. I happen to have an interest in gut. Why? Because there is a gut-brain axis. I am a brain surgeon, so I happen to know anytime someone has a brain injury, they tend to get gut issues associated with it after the brain injury is treated. The reason for that, we now know that the blood-brain barrier, even the cervical cord brain barrier and the gut barrier are all linked together by a lot of these gases that are made that affect mitochondrial function that are activated or deactivated by certain frequencies, of light. And when we begin to make these connections, that's when we're going to be able to help, some of the people that have these problems.
Mm-hmm. So can you just go, and sorry you have to go over the kind of the basics of this, but just making the connection between eating in season or eating out of season and the mechanism of how that drives inflammation and IBD. Like, where is that connection?
It's pretty simple. It comes down to a mitochondrial level, and you need to understand what mitochondria are doing. For example, when I tell people to look at mitochondria and food, realize the basics. Everybody learned in third grade that CO2, water, and sunlight equals sugar. That's photosynthesis. Everybody gets that. What they don't realize is that mitochondria are innovated by evolution to reverse that process. It takes sugars, fats, and proteins and turns them into carbon dioxide and water. It turns out the part of mitochondria that make water is cytochrome 4, which is called CCO or cytochrome C oxidase. Cytochrome C oxidase works because it has 4 red light detectors on it. So basically what nature's telling us that our mitochondria take 4 bytes of red light between 600 and 1,000 nanometers to work. We make a gas from UV light called nitric oxide. Nitric oxide inhibits CCO, so it controls how much water is made. So that tells us that sunlight controls how much water is made in the cell everywhere in the body. So when we talk about seasonal changes, most people who live at high latitudes know that the amount of UV light that's present usually goes away right around August 15th if you're in the northern hemisphere. Well, that's not true on the equator where Jeff Leach did his HOSDA study. See, at the equator, light never changes. It's 12 hours of sunlight from sunup to sundown. UV light shows up the same time every day. Red light is always present 12 hours a day. And the reason why Jeff found in the HOSDA people that they could eat antibiotics, Coca-Cola, pretty much all the things that a gastroenterologist or I would tell you not to eat, the reason the HOSDA could get away with it is because they were in the proper light. The problem is when you move away from the equator, your margin of safety for those things that are grown out of season. See, people think that bananas grow at Boston on December 31st because they're in Whole Foods. It turns out that's not the case. Those bananas come from a part of the world that time of the year that you're not supposed to be eating it. So when you eat that through your gut and your eye gets the signal that there's no UV light there and your skin gets the same signal, that creates a circadian mismatch. And it turns out the clock in your eye is an optical lattice clock. It turns out the clock in your skin also is an optical lattice clock. Those two clocks do not yoke properly with the ones in the gut because you just ate the banana. And what people don't realize is when you eat, it increases blood flow in the mesenteric plexus. This releases more light from the microbiome than should be present. And that's fundamentally what causes the clock genes in the clock to be off. And as a gastroenterologist, we have this pretty big immune system in the gut called the GALT, which is the gut-associated lymphoid tissue. That's where the B and T cells are that people who have Crohn's and IBD are really interested. But what they don't realize, because they've been told that the problem exists there, it's actually a mismatch between those lymphoid cells and the one in the skin. And it turns out the skin's the largest organ in the body, and it has the most B and T cells. So if you're getting two different light stimulus at those two different organs, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to figure out that the B and T cells in your body don't work properly. And that's fundamentally what all autoimmune conditions are linked to. And the two that you happen to be talking about, because you're interested for Crohn's and IBD, that's why it's taken off. Because most people these days live under blue light and they think they can eat things that grow in equatorial or subtropical zones 24/7 because we have a bunch of moron dietitians and nutritionists out that don't understand that the entire food web is linked to the sun.
So, for example, let's say there's somebody with Crohn's who lives in, I don't know, like New York or Chicago, where I'm from. What would be the foods that would be in season? How do people figure that out?
Well, hold on. I wouldn't even go there. See, I'm going to stop you right at the pass. If I had Crohn's, since it's a pretty malignant condition, I would immediately move inside the 20s. And that's the number one thing to do because you need to change the light stimulus quickest. You never want to live in Chicago or New York with those conditions because here's the axiomatic position that I have. You can never get well in the same environment that got you sick. Mm-hmm. And that is a big statement that I'm making. The environment, the light environment specifically dictates how your mitochondrial biology works. So the single most important thing is to change the light environment to sculpt your mitochondrial colony in your gut. The best way to do that is to get back closer to the equator where there's no diurnal variation. Food is not the first thing that I would deal with. Mm-hmm. And anybody who thinks it is, they're not part of my tribe, and they're not even part of the narrative that I'll even engage with them. Why? I look at it like this. When an A is available to you, you don't settle for a B, C, or D. The question you asked me, I believe, is a poor question. Why? Because it's not the first thing you should do. The first thing you should do is change your light environment. So somebody who's got Crohn's and IBD is probably listening to this who lives in Chicago going, well, Doc, I'm not going to move, and do this and do that. And I'm going to tell you, then you better make sure you have a good gastroenterologist who's going to write you a lot of scripts because you're not getting rid of this disease.
Just to play devil's advocate, I'm going to speak on behalf of gastroenterologists who may be listening to this. As there has been a lot of cases of Crohn's, colitis in all over the world. Brazil, it exists, where it's just right at the equator, or even southern states in the U.S. or in South America. It's pretty much everywhere. India is blowing up. So these are obviously closer to the equator. But what I anticipate your response to be to that is that they're still living indoor lifestyles, right?
Well, not only that. Let's take India as a perfect example. Most people know that southern India is loaded with vegans and vegetarians. The latitude in southern India goes from 20 north to 0. What don't you realize? Forget about the indoor stuff, which you're correct. Bangalore has become Facebook and Google's main outsource. So guess what we did? We have non-native EMF over there. Just remember, non-native EMF is just like blue light. It's another situation that creates this problem. All the places that you mentioned, they all have the same issue. It's not just a high latitude and UV light that's the issue. It's also the electromagnetic footprint you're around. Why? Because what don't people like gastroenterologists know, because they weren't taught it, that the mitochondria is an electromagnetic antenna. It pays attention to the entire part of the spectrum, but it turns out the mitochondrial genome is optimized between 250 and 780 nanometer light. That's the light of the sun. Guess what? Humans now live from RF all the way up to cosmic level radiation. And therein lies the problem. So is it truly a latitude only problem for those people there? No, because the way you live your life there also matters. What went on for 5,000 years in India is no longer operational because of how the cities have changed there just in the last 25 or 30 years. And if you look at what's going on in India, prior to 50 years ago, they had very little problems with diabetes. They now lead the world in diabetics. Mm-hmm. In 2019, it's estimated they'll have 117 million diabetics in southern India. Mm-hmm. Just think about that for a minute. And most of your listeners are probably hearing this, don't realize that diabetes also is a mitochondrial disease, also tied to blue light exposure and non-native EMF, and I believe actually is very, very closely linked to some of the two diseases that you're talking about now. So when I say control your light environment, I'm not just talking about indoor versus outdoor light. I'm talking about man-made use of the electromagnetic spectrum. And that is irrespective if you're inside, outside, or where your latitude is. You need to do what the Hasda did, what Jeff Leach showed. These people are equatorial people that live outside. They do have cell phones, but their electromagnetic footprint compared to the patients that you treat in Chicago are like comparing a nuclear war to a street fight.
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, that's... So you mentioned the vegetarianism in India, and I've heard you talk a lot about seafood, particularly oysters, being important for everyone. But with respect to IBD, can you explain what the importance is of that, and what does someone do if they're culturally coming from a background of vegetarianism?
Yeah, you forget your culture, because guess what? Your biology could care less about your culture, your societal roles. When you're sick, you have to be all in for you. You have to be the CEO of you and understand why you're doing it. And I realize that some people listening to this may say, well, that's not the way the world operates. Well, when you're sick and you have a disease like these two diseases that most people that get it don't get better from an allopathic standpoint, you have to do things differently. So let's talk about DHA, because that's what the story in seafood is all about. We come from a kingdom called the eukaryotes, and bacteria come from another kingdom called prokaryotes. What separates the two fundamentally? Our cell membranes are loaded with DHA. It turns out that our skin, gut, and brain are really loaded with it. In fact, there's more DHA in the human retina attached to the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the clock timing mechanism, than you can imagine. The only place that eukaryotes don't have DHA is on the inner mitochondrial membrane, because it still retains its bacterial origin. So what does DHA fundamentally do? It's a 22-carbon polyunsaturated fat that comes in three different positions called SN1, SN2, and SN3. What happens is in photosynthetic plants in the sea, like algae, fish eat it, they turn the DHA from the SN1 and SN3 position to the SN2. Why are these details important? Because SN2 is the only position that gets into the eukaryotic brain, gut, and skin. So SN2 replaces the DHA. What does the DHA do in your cell membrane? The cell membrane in humans is an electromagnetic antenna that allows the sun directly to talk to your mitochondria by way of a lot of different processes. One of them is through your blood. The other one is through your microbiome. So the key is, what does DHA do? This 22-carbon PUFA basically flattens out, becomes planar, and it starts to look like a wire. And it has double bonds in between the carbons. The reason why that's important, it turns out that this allows for electrons. We call it, DHA has an amazing pi electron cloud above it. So what does that mean in English to the people listening to this? It means it's a wire, like a copper wire in your house, that moves electrons across it. And it turns out that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to turn sunlight into a DC electric current. And it turns out on our brain, in our gut, in our blood, our red blood cells also tend to have tons of DHA in it. We want the ability to move electrons, because when we do that, we become more energy efficient. When you don't do that, you lose it. What's one of the main factors that lowers the amount of DHA in all these tissues? Turns out that excessive blue light exposure or excessive exposure to the electromagnetic spectrum limits the amount of DHA. And this is the reason why in another specialty of medicine, specifically the eye, ophthalmology, we're now seeing people develop myopia at unbelievable rates. We're now seeing people with glaucoma. We're now seeing people with ocular melanoma. Why? These things are all related to the excessive blue light hazard that starts in the retina because of photooxidation from this. The same effect is happening to us everywhere in our body because we now are blue light individuals. So when you realize that you live in a microwave blue lit world, it means that your de facto default factory settings have to have way more DHA in them than normal. So if you're a vegan, you're really screwed because the only source of DHA that you can get is usually through the plant kingdom. And unfortunately, that doesn't work for humans because it's mostly in the SN1 and SN3 position. It has to be an SN2 to get in the peripheral and central nervous system where most of your cell membranes that matter, especially for the gut, connect because of that brain-gut axis. So I wish I could make you an easier answer for this, but that's the answer why seafood is irreplaceable in any autoimmune condition, and really any condition that's mitochondrial based.
No, I like that you don't dumb things down. I like that you are clearly really up on all of this, the basic science research, all of the new information. It's refreshing to hear an MD actually know this information because, as you know, clinicians that are practicing medicine are oftentimes 10, 20 years behind what the cutting edge science is. And it's just so refreshing to hear that you know this stuff. And a lot of people, I would say probably more than 90% of clinicians out there have no idea about any of the things that you're talking. And when I first started listening to you, I actually wasn't sure. I had to confirm what you were saying myself. So I did read. I'm obviously not as up on all the biophysics research and things you're interested in, but I did read some of your references, and the stuff you're saying checks out. It checks out. I've looked into it. Not all of it, but certainly some of the topics. I haven't looked at all the topics in detail that you've mentioned, but a lot of the things that I looked up that I had some doubts about, it checks out.
Right. Well, Samir, this is what I would tell you, and this is the key for clinicians who are listening to this. You know that in clinical medicine, I still practice neurosurgery. We are overwhelmed with the literature. So you know what the key for a clinician is who's interested in really learning how biology works is you have to focus in on what matters and not what doesn't. So you have to unlearn to relearn. So most of this, and I'm going to be politically incorrect here, most of the shit that we learned in medical school is wrong. And when you begin to realize that it really comes down to light, water, magnetism, and you're a clinician, say, okay, how much do I really know about electrons? But let's really dumb this down for the clinician audience. What is food fundamentally? It's an electromagnetic barcode of electrons and protons. Now, you tell me in medical school when they told you that. And I challenge every doctor who's listening to this, if you don't believe me, go open up your damn biochemistry book and show me where the input to mitochondria is carbohydrate, protein, or lipid transfer. It's not. It's called electron chain transport. And it goes from NADH all the way to oxygen. Most guys in medical school never learn that NADH is made from tryptophan. It's a fluorophore protein. It only activates through UV light and things made in UV light. What's the big deal with cytochrome C oxidase? I already told you that answer. It's got 4 red light chromophores, 620, 680, 760, and 860. And it's inhibited by nitric oxide, which is made by UVA light. When you start to see all these pieces, you start to go, really, what is a mitochondria really doing? And it turns out it's deciphering the Rosetta Stone of electrons and protons in foods. And that's the reason why in a mitochondria we have 3 dehydrogenases. It's the reason why the TCA cycle has 9 enzymatic steps to make sure it only takes out the right type of hydrogen to move it through the ATPase. When you start to see all these little pieces, you start to realize, why did I learn the pentose phosphate pathway? Why did I learn glycolysis? Is it really that important when you don't have the fundamentals down? And the reason I bring this up is because the clinicians out there can simplify their life. If you start to focus in on what matters and stop reading the shit that doesn't, boy, let me tell you what, it's really easy to stay up on the science.
One more question about diet before we move on to some other topics. But many of the diets people use for IBD avoid processed foods. So,
Yep.
There's like illegal foods that, and a lot of them have to do with certain additives in the food, like carrageenan, maltodextrin, which have been shown to maybe damage the gut barrier and cause dysbiosis. Is this an aspect that you think would still be important for people with Crohn's and colitis as far as like avoiding processed foods in general?
Yeah, I do. But you know what I'm hoping your next question is? Ask me why.
Why?
All right. Well, here's the real reason. It goes to what I just said to you. What people don't realize, processed food to a quantum biologist basically means there's too much deuterium and not enough hydrogen in the food. Most people do not realize that hydrogen has an isotope called deuterium. Deuterium is actually set through the water table in the hydrology cycle. Remember that I said to you before, all food is linked to photosynthesis. How does photosynthesis work? CO2 plus water equals sugar with added sunlight. So what people don't realize, when you go high up on the planet towards the poles, deuterium content in water diminishes. When you get in the equatorial area, it gets close to seawater, right around 150 to 155 parts per million. So the key is the type of food where it's grown has a deuterium content in it. Turns out processed food has no control programs by photosynthesis. So the hydrogen that's used, say, by Nestle or by, ConAgra, they are putting massive amounts of deuterium. In fact, if you check out like maltodextrin and actually did a spectroscopic exam of it, you would find that it is almost wholly loaded with deuterium. It's a deuterium bomb. What's a deuterium bomb in nature? Fruits. All fruits are deuterium bombs. You need to understand why it's a problem. It turns out your mitochondria that make the water in your cells make deuterium depleted water. So in other words, the type of water that we make biologically to really live has to be free of deuterium. So the reason why processed foods are bad, because you're asking your mitochondria to handle foods that are loaded with things that break the ATPase. Why? You know as a doctor, a gastroenterologist, that your ATPase is a proton pump. And protons are basically hydrogen atoms that have the electron stripped off. The proton channel in the ATPase only fits H+. It doesn't fit deuterium. Deuterium has an extra neutron on it. And when you have too much deuterium in your matrix, the ATPase breaks. Let me ask you a question, Samir. If you break your ATPase, are you going to be thermally or energy efficient or not?
No, you're going to be inefficient. Yeah.
That's what people with IBD and Crohn's are. They are thermally inefficient at the gut level. That's the reason why they need to avoid those things.
Wow. This is a perspective I've never heard before, and certainly it's something I'll have to look into. I just remember, I think it was a few years ago, typing in inflammatory bowel disease and mitochondria, and there was, I think, a case report from like 1950 or something of something that's completely unrelated, but I think nowadays there is some more work going on, not with respect to IBD in particular, but autoimmunity and mitochondria and kind of the mechanisms behind that happens. But certainly, what I'm talking from the perspective of a clinician and going to the major conferences, and nobody is talking about this. So,
well, I mean, the reason why they're not is because they're reading shit they shouldn't be reading. Like, for example, I just gave you something so fundamental that clinicians don't even realize that deuterium and hydrogen are not equal, yet biology has a huge bias towards H+. So when you consider the food story, anything made by man has no photosynthetic controls. That's the key control process or quality assurance program for nature. So man ignores this, and you eat the crap. Of course, it's going to break every motor. You know what it's akin to? It's akin to buying a brand new Ferrari and putting ball bearings into the engine. It makes you would never do that to the car, but yet we do it all the time. And the problem is we have gastroenterologists and dietitians and nutritionists go around and say, hey, processed food's bad. Okay, tell me why. If you don't know the reason why, you should really just shut your pie hole.
Right.
And the thing is, people need to understand the fundamentals. I always tell people, when you spew half-truths, you always spew full lies. And with people that have this condition, these two conditions in the gut, it's massively important for them to understand this deuterium story. And I'll explain it to you further. The ATPase, we now know from a quantum biologic perspective, it's been checked in the literature multiple times. It's 100% quantum nano rotor engine. The FO head on its spins at unbelievable rates through protons. And guess what makes it 100% thermally efficient? This is going to blow your mind. Red light. Do you know why it works on red light? The dominant portion of sunlight is 42% infrared A. That's what makes your mitochondria spin optimally, okay? Mm-hmm. What happens if you have clothes on? Does your gut get that information? Because here's what most of your doctors listen to this and the patients that have these conditions don't know. Red light is the only part of the spectrum of light that penetrates to touch every single mitochondria in your body. It penetrates the body anywhere between 10 centimeters and 30 centimeters. So you are designed by nature to be naked in sunlight all the time. And when I say this to patients, they look at me like I'm crazy. And then I say this to them. Tell me one other mammal that emerges from the mother's vagina that's wearing the clothes that you're wearing or the sunglasses you're wearing right now. And they look at me stunned. And I said, see, this is the reason why Jack doesn't have to teach hippos and lions quantum biology, but he has to teach stupid humans this because they have this brain that allows them to break all of nature's laws because society and culture have put these wonderful ideas in their head that have broken some of the fundamental laws that we operate with. And when you start to see it from this perspective, you go, well, wait a minute, Jack, you're saying that if we don't get this red light, the ATPase can't spin as fast? Yeah, guess what happens? You have to eat different types of food to offset the energy costs. Otherwise, your brain won't work well. That's the reason why most people who have Crohn's and IBD have horrible cognitive abilities that go with it. They don't think as well as they used to. Mm-hmm. This is the reason why it happens, because their ATPase can't spin as fast. How do you fix that? Put them in sunlight or put them in red light and watch them how they get better.
So would you say, as far regarding like the mitochondria specifically in the gut, so the sunlight does penetrate deep enough to, like, let's say you were laying outside in the sun and you obviously expose your abdomen to the sun.
It penetrates all the way through your body. That's the whole point of red light. Mm-hmm. That not every frequency of light does that, but guess what? Red light does. And that's the reason why I always tell people, you want to get better when you have these two conditions, you got to have skin in the game. My take home for anybody who's got either one of these conditions, make like the Sphinx. Every morning when the sun rises, look with your eyes and your skin, with all four of your extremities grounded, with your gut exposed to the sun. If you do that for 2 hours every morning, and you do a little bit, especially this time of the year, since we're right around the summer solstice, from 4 to 8 p.m., you will freaking win. In fact, all those damn drugs that the gastroenterologist puts you on, you'll start to see you need less and less and less of them. And if you're really smart, if you live at a high latitude, you'll get your ass down where the diurnal frequencies don't change and there's red light constantly present from sun up to sun down. That's the key. That's the reason why I told you before. If I had these diseases, I would have my ass down inside the 20s.
Mm-hmm. And that's why you live in Louisiana, right? You moved down.
Yeah, 28th latitude.
Right. So, okay.
And just so you know, both of these conditions have a latitude base. That's the reason why in your literature, it's linked to vitamin D. And people in gastroenterology don't seem to understand the higher your vitamin D level is. I'll give you an axiom for both of these conditions that I have. If your vitamin D level, the 25 dihydroxy vitamin D is above 60 on that test, the chance of you developing Crohn's or IBD goes down substantially.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, our goal as far as clinically is to get it up above 30 because that's been associated with better outcomes, less surgery. But
30 is too low. 30 to me is ridiculous. I think the institutes of medicine have done medicine a complete disservice because most of the studies that they've come out with are been done on blue light toxic people. If you study the equatorial Africans, with dark skin, and they're harder to raise their vitamin D, on average, they're between 60 and 80. So I tell all my white folks that live in the United States that your base number, no matter where you are, is 60. I personally want it around 120. My own personal level, I just did it 2 weeks ago, is 112.
Wow. Okay. I don't think I've ever seen a level that high.
The reason why is because you have to know how to build your solar callus to get it that way.
Yeah.
And you're correct. Most doctors don't even understand how the solar callus is built because they don't understand hybrid tanning. They don't understand how a guy like me with freckles who comes from the 59th latitude can stay in the sun for 12 hours a day and not, get French fried. The reason why? Turns out red light preconditions your skin so that you can accept UV radiation. And when people hear this and they see the studies published, they go, how come nobody's talking about this? Well, it's pretty simple. Because nobody reads in other disciplines. That's the real problem.
Right.
And I happen to do that because the one thing I've learned in biology is that every single organ system ties to others. And the problem is when we read gastroenterology, we're just focusing on the gut. We seem to forget how it links to the brain and how it links to the eye and how it links, to the immune system. And that's the key problem right now in medicine.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. As far as people who people who are Caucasian, who come from, at least genetically may have evolved, at least in the more immediate time period, at a higher latitude. Maybe you have a family history of melanoma or skin cancer. People, at least doctors, get nervous about recommending getting as much sun exposure as possible to those kind of people.
I'm going to stop you there because you're going to make my head explode. I'll probably send this to you on Twitter today so that maybe you can add it to this podcast notes.
Okay.
The incidence of melanoma is reduced by solar exposure, just so you know that. Mm-hmm. See, it's another problem for dermatology that if you look in their literature, which they refuse to do, that the link for melanoma and all skin cancers is associated with low vitamin D status. I want you to stop for a minute as a doctor. What makes vitamin D? It takes LDL cholesterol, 312 nanometer light, UVB light, to make sulfated vitamin D3. And yet, in the literature, it says that all cancers are associated with low vitamin D. So how in the hell could the sun cause this? It's complete bullshit. Mm-hmm. Now, what is linked in the literature with melanoma? Do you know what stimulates melanocytes? Blue light. Let me ask you a question, Samir. What kind of light are your patients sitting under? Sunlight or blue light?
Oh, absolutely. Most of them completely blue lit.
Well, guess what?
Environments.
That's the cause of the skin cancers that are out there. And melanomas, you know what the fastest melanoma is right now in humans? Ocular melanoma. Mm-hmm. Guess why? What are we looking at?
Blue light.
There you go. We're not looking at the sun. I can tell you this. Most of the clinicians listening to this and most of the people listening to this are going to probably be accessing it through a blue lit screen. Mm-hmm. I'm actually talking to you right now on this computer with my raw optics blue blocking glasses on because I happen to be inside, which is another topic. If you want to know in indoor existence, why does it cause you to have, by definition, blue light toxicity? Because glass that are present in all of our buildings block all the UV and block 40 to 60% of the red. So what does that mean? It has no effect on blue light. So just by being indoors, you are horribly blue light toxic. Mm-hmm. So guess what? If you have Crohn's or IBD and you know that you live behind walls and glass, you're effectively shining blue light on your eyes and in your skin to ruin that circadian mechanism in your gut. That's the reason you got the disease.
I've read some research on fasting and also like time-restricted eating, and my understanding regarding the clock genes in the gut are supposed to be more regulated by timing of eating than the day and night cycle. Is that correct? Or
no, it's not.
It's not.
It's definitely time-restricted eating, which is part of what the leptin prescription is all about, is definitely present, but it's a secondary, tertiary mechanism. The primary mechanism of the SCN and the peripheral clock genes is it's an optical lattice clock. So it is controlled by light and day. What actually is the key regulator of the entire system. It's melatonin. Melatonin is made from an aromatic amino acid that has to be programmed by UV light. So most people think melatonin is the hormone of darkness. They're shocked to learn that it's made from an aromatic amino acid that absorbs UV light. So it turns out UVA and UVB light in the morning are actually what makes melatonin from serotonin. You know that serotonin's largest collection is in the gut. It turns out that this is a huge, big issue. Why is melatonin the key regulator? Because it controls autophagy and apoptosis in mitochondria. It controls the mitochondrial genome. So when you hear that, you start to go, okay, this makes total sense now. This is the reason why people who have bad guts can't sleep, because their melatonin gets destroyed. The story gets even more interesting when you realize that the blue light detector in humans is found in the skin, eye, and blood vessels of the gut. That's called melanopsin, and it's linked to vitamin A. And when blue light hits melanopsin, vitamin A gets liberated, and it destroys all the photoreceptors. What's the number one photoreceptor that you worry about in gastroenterology? It's leptin. And leptin gets destroyed, and that's why blue light makes people fat. That's how I actually fixed my problem. The key is you have to understand that all these hormones, the levers that push them, the stimulus that push them, isn't biochemistry, it's light. And it's frequencies of light. And until you get that message, you are going to be pissing in the wind in your specialty.
What about vitamin D supplementation, especially if you're I'm assuming you would say it's no substitute for the sun, but what is the... It's a
great question. I'll tell you the reason why, and I'll give you the analogy that I use with patients, and you can decide to tear it apart or not. Remember that vitamin D is made endogenously through the system I just told you. LDL cholesterol has to be sulfated by sunlight. It gets converted to vitamin D, 25 dihydroxy vitamin D, and then it gets further transferred to 125 in the kidney and liver. Mm-hmm. All this happens with sunlight. Here's the key that I tell people. If you take a vitamin D pill, it's akin to hiring a gym trainer to do push-ups for you and thinking you're getting a benefit. Why? Because when you take a pill for something you make exogenously, you uncouple the positive and negative feedback loops, and it actually makes it worse. This is the reason why, when you said earlier that so many people in your literature have noticed that the vitamin D level is linked to outcomes in these two conditions. And you're right about that. The problem that gastroenterologists don't realize is putting people on vitamin D supplementation alone and not changing their light hygiene protocol on their skin actually makes the situation worse. This is the reason why primary care doctors are telling everybody, hey, I'm putting people with low vitamin Ds on D3 and it's not doing shit. This is the reason why. And we learn about this in medical school. We learn about the negative and positive feedback loops. And when I give talks around the world, I try to explain this by utilizing the predator and prey analogy that was present in Yellowstone Park. When we took the wolves out, everything about Yellowstone Park's geology and its biodiversity changed. When we put the predator back in, everything improved. And that's the same thing that's present in nature, especially with vitamin D. So I'm not a huge fan of taking vitamin D supplementation unless the light hygiene changes. So, for example, if I had a patient with Crohn's who said had an intracranial pathology and they came in with a vitamin D of 24, I would put that patient on a specific dose of vitamin D3 with K2, but I would absolutely mandate that they build their solar callus, and I would teach them how to do that. If they did that at the same time, I'd reassess their vitamin D in 6 weeks with a blood test. And what I would do is then decrease the amount of supplementation in K2 they use, because what they're effectively doing is they're using the sun to do it more. Now, if you happen to live, say, in Chicago and you're doing this in December, you're screwed. The only way to do it then is to get them to go down to Mexico at the 20th latitude, which, believe it or not, is what I do to a lot of people with this condition. Because if you do not use the sun to build up your vitamin D binding protein, which is basically your bank account that you have to build in the summertime to offset high latitude living, you are in a deep hole. And most people that have Crohn's and IBD suffer from this condition.
So is there any benefit to getting sun exposure in the winter when there is no significant UV exposure?
Yeah, you already answered that question. Remember, I told you that sunlight always has 42% infrared A. What did I tell you about cytochrome C oxidase? It has 4 red light chromophores. So the answer is yes. What's the number one red light chromophore in your body? Because we haven't talked about this, but you need to know it. It's water. Water absorbs 600 to 3,100 nanometer light. Guess what? What is the solar spectrum in red? 600 to 3,100. Isn't that amazing that nature follows the sun? Shocking, huh?
You've talked about the mitochondrial genome and how doctors, researchers are focusing on the wrong genome, the nuclear genome. And there's been a lot of genome-wide association studies regarding IBD, and they found some like certain associations, but nothing like a slam dunk. This is the genetic cause.
Right.
Why do you feel the mitochondrial genome is something more to focus on now?
Well, it's pretty simple. The world expert in mitochondrial biology is a guy named Dr. Doug Wallace. He's at the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. He's the guy that found out about maternal inheritance over 40 years ago with the mitochondrial genome. And he's gone on record on his public YouTube video saying that 85% of human disease is linked to mitochondrial disease, not nuclear. I have gone on record and saying I believe it's more like 98%. And it's pretty simple, the reason why. The mitochondrial genome makes free radicals. That's what it does. The free radical signal is basically unpaired electrons that I believe create a Rosetta Stone or an alphabet that basically make the epigenetic software program that changed the nuclear genome. So when you see GWAS studies, the reason why you never see it, because the missing link is you don't know what the frequency of light is and you have no idea what the free radical signal is. And one of the things that we know is the free radical signal is optimized in mitochondria between 250 and 780 nanometer. But what happens when you live in Chicago at the Sears Tower on the 84th floor and you're sitting in 5G soup at that floor because the antennas all around you? Well, the free radical signal you make there is radically different than the one you would make, say, in Uganda. And that free radical signal turns on the nuclear genome. That's what gives you diseases. So when you understand that the mitochondrial genome is an electromagnetic antenna for light, and it makes a free radical signal that turns on or turns off the nuclear genome, it should be no shock why all the nuclear genome studies are worthless for these conditions, because you need to understand how the mitochondrial genome does its job through the epigenetic software program of the free radical signal made in the mitochondria. That's the key. And that's what Doug Wallace has spent his entire career laying out. He's the guy that has said, Samir, I don't know how much you know about him. He made the most unbelievable comment 5 years ago. He said 98% of the NIH budget goes to studying the nuclear genome. Only 2% goes to studying the mitochondrial. So if you want to know why people with Crohn's and IBD are extremely frustrated, we're studying the wrong genome. It's that simple.
Mm-hmm. And I just want to reiterate, I'm sure some clinicians may be thinking, oh, if it's mitochondrial, if all diseases are mitochondrial, why aren't all diseases maternally inherited? But it's more complex than that, right? It's because it has to do with the environment.
The clinician that would say that to you or me, announce themselves as completely ignorant. And that's the truth. And when I hear stuff like that, it makes my head explode, because we don't need linear thinkers in medicine. We need nonlinear thinkers, because guess what? Nature and everything in biology works on nonlinear equilibrium. Anybody who thinks that biology is an equilibrium bias, I will say, just get out of my face. There's nothing about biology that is at equilibrium. The only time that biology is at equilibrium is when we're dead. That's what rigor mortis is.
Another thing people say, clinicians or that I've talked to about this, about the whole thing about electromagnetic radiation, and they always come back at me saying, oh, it's non-ionizing. It has no effects on the human body. So I'd just like for you to briefly just tell them, like, what are the known physiologic effects of EMF on the human body? I
would tell every clinician listening to this is probably the best question you asked me. There's a book out there called Going Somewhere, written by Dr. Andrew Marino. He's not only a lawyer, but also a biophysicist who worked with Dr. Robert O. Becker, and he lays out the case of how non-ionizing radiation is the key thing. most people have a bias in biology saying that the only way we can change the genome is through ionizing DNA or RNA. It's totally not true. I just told you the answer, that non-ionizing light radiation within the solar spectrum changes the free radical signal, which sculpts the genome. So it turns out it's non-ionizing radiation that's the big thing. We just had the NTP study done by the U.S. federal government that showed RF radiation, which is very low end, causes cancer in nocturnal animals. And when you understand that low-end non-ionizing radiation can cause schwannomas and in both the heart and peripheral nerves in nocturnal animals, and you understand the mechanism of melanopsin, it means the risk is greater in diurnal animals, which is what humans are. And this means anybody who's got Crohn's or IBD, if you put your cell phone in your pocket anywhere close to your gut, you are an absolute moron, unless it's in airplane mode. Mm-hmm. And I'm just going to tell you that ionizing radiation isn't needed for human disease. It's just not. And that is easily bared out in the literature. The reason for that is the EMF, the incident level of EMF that comes in, creates the free radical signal. The free radical signal then correlates to how much extreme low frequency UV light is released in the cell, usually from the nuclear genome. Most clinicians don't even know that every cell on this planet, whether it's plant, prokaryote, or eukaryote, release a certain amount of extreme low frequency UV light. They're called biophotons. And who proved this was a guy named Fritz Popp about 30 years ago when he used photomultipliers on every cell. There's a book out there called Light Sculpting Life, written by a guy named Roland Van Wyck, that covers this history of 125 years all the way back. And I can tell you, when I tell clinicians about this, that human disease is associated with more extreme low-frequency UV light release, people who are healthy have less, because you're designed to retain the light that you absorb from the sun. It turns out that every other part of the electromagnetic spectrum allows us to release too much light. That's what leads to disease. So what am I saying here? Everybody that has Crohn's and IBD is releasing too much light from the cells that are sick in their gut. And the only way to tighten that back up is to use solar radiations to help it. That can reverse the process. When you think about drugs that doctors use for these conditions, what are drugs? They are also electromagnetic footprints that are not quantized to the system. That's why some of them lead to good effects and bad effects. The key is we don't have enough information within the drugs that we do in light. And none of the drugs that we use are really quantized for our mitochondrial genome. This is the reason why drug therapy ultimately fails. And to give you the final statement here, Samir, one of the world researchers on photobiomodulation, which is the study of red light therapy, her name is Tina Carew. You can look this up. She published a paper about 3 or 4 years ago with the most provocative title, Is Red Light Therapy a Replacement for Drug Therapy? You can look it up. Mm-hmm. When you funnel through the entire paper, which is excellent, the answer is yes. And the reason why the answer is yes is what I told you before. All of nature and anything that has either a mitochondria or a chloroplast, it's optimized to red light. Mm-hmm. Nature is telling us that it wants to take 4 bites of the red light between 600 and 1,000 nanometer light. That's what we're optimized for. And if you don't have your life in that game, you're going to get sick.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about these things that are sold? I actually at one point bought a dream canopy, so kind of this Faraday cage around my bed that was, grounded. Is that something that's going to work if you live in downtown Chicago?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're living in Chicago, that's like saying, hey, I smoke filtered cigarettes versus unfiltered. It's just ridiculous.
Right.
And yeah, do I think there's a benefit? Sure. But, the smarter move is you should get out of a city that has tons of light pollution and allows the unfettered use of non-native EMF. The real reason I say that is because when you understand radiation really well, it works on the inverse square law. So that means the more obedient idiots are in your town, the worse it is for you. And you know that Chicago is a whole lot bigger than my city, like in New Orleans. We have 350,000 people. You have some neighborhoods in Chicago that have that many people. Mm-hmm. And remember, each one of those people are using between 12 and 15 Wi-Fi enabled devices that release what? RF and microwaves and blue light screens. So when you start doing the math, you start going, this is the argument I'd say. When you do, say, a colonoscopy or you do some, like an EGD, would you put your junk in a fluoro machine for 8 or 10 hours a day? Because that's exactly what you're doing when you live in Chicago. Mm-hmm.
Okay, and what do you think about, I've seen some clinicians who are kind of up on the whole mitochondrial health thing. They order this like Genova testing, like this Nutri-Eval, and kind of recommend supplements depending on, you know, the pathways, what you may have as far as the metabolites. What do you think about using that test? I've never seen the results of that, but I've seen people talking about it.
Yeah, Samir, I'm glad you asked me this question. I believe, because, you know, in this podcast, I've pounded on our profession enough. I think the functional medicine paradigm is worse because these tests really don't tell you fundamentally what's going on. Looking at substrate level biochemistry is not fundamental. Looking at free radical signaling is. Looking at extreme low frequency UV light is. These functional medicine doctors don't know anything about this. And I will just tell you, taking a supplement, in my view, is no different than putting someone on methotrexate, you know, for, you know, Crohn's or IBD. It's just a therapy that needs to be rethought. I think supplementation is horrendous. It usually makes people worse. And I think the key to understand in the functional medicine paradigm is they are trying to offer people other options that we're not offering. It's because most of our minds are closed to this type of science that we're talking about today. And I believe that when people come around to my way of thinking, they're going to realize it really goes back to what Einstein said. Nature is really simple. You're designed to be in her game, and if you start breaking her rules, she's going to make you pay a biologic toll, and that's called disease. And it's way simpler than you want to imagine because we're built to work around that light. I am no fan of most of those tests because I believe that most of those people basically get wallet biopsied by the test and then all the supplements after it. It just doesn't help. But the thing is, people go to it because most of the therapies that we use in allopathic medicine are pretty horrible too. Mm-hmm. We don't have good answers because people don't want to do the heavy lifting that we're trying to talk about on this podcast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it is daunting for people to kind of uproot their life and move somewhere, especially if they have family that lives in a particular area and they want to stay connected. And I know you've said that it is important to stay connected with family and friends. That's a big part of health as well.
You got to look at it like this: if you're not good enough for yourself, who are you good for? Right. Really, that's the black swan mitochondria acronym. Just so you know, I'm originally from Germany and Ireland. My people then migrated to New York. I went from New York to Connecticut, down to Nashville, left Nashville, went to Mississippi. Now I'm in New Orleans. What's my trajectory, my friend? I went from the 59th latitude to 28th. So guess what? As I've gotten older, I've realized through all the science that you and I have talked about that being at a lower latitude and living outside under the power of nature is the thing that's going to keep me away from our profession the most. Mm-hmm. I'm directionally accurate, and I'm going to tell you that if your family acts as an anchor to keep you in a suboptimal environment, you have a duty to you and only you to fix that. And I'm not saying it's easy, but I can tell you I did it. I left family behind. When they tried to put the guilt trip on me that I can't believe you're leaving me, I'm like, well, I don't want to be 360 pounds because I'm not going to make it to 60 years old if I do that. And there's nothing more important to me than time. And my job as a neurosurgeon and my job as a theoretical quantum biologist is to teach people the value of time, because time is the fundamental basis of all disease. And when you start to value time, all of a sudden the things that you think are daunting become not so daunting. Mm-hmm. I don't like settling for a B, C, or a D when I know an A is available.
Dr. Kruse, have you seen the television show Naked and Afraid?
No. I don't watch TV at all for obvious reasons.
Oh, obvious, yeah. Well, it's a show. I think it's on National Geographic, but they pretty much drop two people with no clothes on. They're allowed to bring a couple tools with them into some kind of jungle or forest, and they have to survive for, I believe it's several weeks. Like they spend 35 days or something, where they're completely in nature. They're not wearing anything. And they have to hunt their own food, fish for their own. Usually, they end up fishing or eating insects or snakes, but they have to survive. But I think a lot of that kind of ties in what you're what you're recommending, kind of that intervention. So just kind of bringing it all together for patients with IBD. What is the time frame, like as far as your recommendations of being in nature, and if you be a little bit more specific about that for these patients, and what is the time frame? What can they expect? Is this something that's going to work in the course of a few weeks, few months? Or we're talking years? When is the improvement expected to happen?
Well, the key is it depends on how severe the disease is. You know that IBD and Crohn's comes in different varieties. I mean, I've seen people that had Crohn's that wound up getting colon cancer within a year. Mm-hmm. That's not the usual time course, but if somebody gets it that bad, they need to do exceptional things. Obviously, it ties to the latitude and the type of life choices they're making around blue light and non-native EMF. But here's the real answer. First thing they need to do is they need to know how to use the sun to fix their colony of mitochondria in their gut. So they have to know how to build their solar callus. So here are the basic rules. Since it's June 20th today, we'll use that. Today's the summer solstice in the northern hemisphere. It's the winter solstice in the southern hemisphere. The time to be in the light is going to be from sunrise for the first 2 hours after that. Why? Because it's predominantly red. Mm-hmm. This time of the year, 4 to 8 p.m. is also good because it's mostly red. How do you begin to build your solar callus? You need to overwhelm your system with red light from the sun. You need that 600 to 3100 nanometer light. You probably don't need much midday light. You probably only need 15 or 20 minutes in that midday. As you build that red light up, then you're going to find out when you do go in the light, say between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., that's more loaded with UVA and UVB, you'll be able to tolerate that longer. How long should you be in that? That ties to the color of your skin. The darker you are, the more you can do. The lighter you are, the more you have to be careful. I told you before, I'm a white guy with freckles. You know, most people would look at my skin. I have a Fitzpatrick 1 skin. They'd say there's no way that you'd ever be able to stay at the 20th latitude for 12 hours a day. But Samir, guess what? I do it. I go to Mexico all the time. And the reason why is I am a complete whore when it comes to red light. I'm constantly in red light in the sun at the 28th latitude. And when I'm inside, like I am now, I have infrared A light panels all around me. My clinic has them. I will never be inside without a red light somewhere on me because I know that the glass blocks 40 to 60% of it and there's no UV getting through. So those are the basic things that I do. I tend not to use any LED or fluorescent lights inside. The lights stay out. If I do have lights, I'll use infrared A bulbs. I can tell you the light that I live under compared to most of the people listening to this podcast, I'm a sun guy. If you guys saw my skin right now, in fact, if you go on my Instagram page, which is Dr. Jack Kruse, you'll see a picture of me with 2 of my private clients in the pool. Take a look how dark I am. And just remember, I'm an Irish-German guy. When you see that, you'll see that I got my skin in the game. And the key thing that I would tell everybody with Crohn's and IBD, that I'm telling you, this will help you. And the reason I'm passionate about this, especially on the Crohn's side, one of my former employees lost a son, 25 years old, to colon cancer from Crohn's disease. And he was a gamer. He was constantly living a nighttime existence, you know, a typical night owl. And I kept warning him and warning him and warning him. And then his Crohn's flipped to colon cancer and he was dead in a year. Mm-hmm. I am dead serious about this. I don't care what the clinicians who are listening to say. Sunlight reduces all-cause mortality, including in these 2 conditions. That's been studied 9 times in meta-analysis. The last one was in 2016 in Sweden. I've posted the pictures from that talk that I gave many times on Twitter. Samir, I promise you sometime today, I'll post a picture of melanoma for you, and I'll post this one about the all-cause mortality, because maybe you can put it in your show notes.
Yeah.
People need to understand that this data is out there. It's just not well known. And just because it's not well known doesn't mean your experts in gastroenterology are correct. Mm-hmm. You need to ask better questions to get better answers. And I'm going to tell you, I'm very optimistic for people with Crohn's and IBD, because I think they're very easily dealt with if you're willing to change the light environment that you have.
I think we'll leave it there. I think that's. I think it's good that you're giving people some hope. There's a lot of people out there suffering with this condition, and we have medications that are effective, but to be honest, long-term outcomes with a lot of these are not ideal, and and most Crohn's patients end up requiring surgery, about 80%. So, and it's just so refreshing to hear a completely different perspective, because I feel like we're still going down this same road where we're kind of looking at mouse models, looking at the inflammatory cascade, finding a particular target, coming up with a biologic drug to target it, and we're getting the similar outcomes with all of them, over time. I mean, they're helpful, especially, as you said, if it's somebody who's living in Chicago or in an area where you can't make these changes, but and ultimately your theories, they completely make sense to me, and I'm completely engaged with what you're saying, and I want to read more about some of the topics that you mentioned today that I wasn't familiar with.
Well, Samir, I want to say one other thing. You mentioned something about drug targets, how we pick them up in mice and rodents and nocturnal animals. Remember, they're nocturnal, they're not diurnal like we are. But here's the big thing. You made the comment that you find one target. This is what I want to say to you about sunlight. When sun hits your skin, it makes 1,400 metabolites from LDL cholesterol to vitamin D. 1,400. So that's like getting 1,400 drug targets. Those 1,400 metabolites then affect 1,250 nuclear genes. I want you to think about that for a minute. So what am I saying to you? Sunlight is like having a compound pharmacy operational in you all the time. It's not the one drug, one target thing. That's the reason why the big pharma modalities often fail, because they're too highly focused. And it turns out our system is designed to work in a nonlinear fashion. That's what sunlight effectively is. It's a nonlinear stimulus. And until people get this fundamental message, we're going to keep tripping over the same mistakes that we've made in the past.
Dr. Kruse, how can people find you online? And if they want more information about you and your blog, where do they go?
Yeah, they can go to jackkruse.com. That's my website and my blog. I also have a Patreon site, which has really high-level stuff about quantum biology. You can find that at www.patreon.com/Dr. Jack Kruse. You can find me on Instagram, Dr. Jack Kruse. Facebook, I have the Dr. Jack Kruse public page, and I also have Kruse Longevity Center page on Facebook, which is my private clinic where I actually do quantum biologic processes for some of my members from my website. You can find me on Twitter as you found me, at Dr. Jack Kruse, and I'm on LinkedIn as well. I think I'm Dr. Jack Kruse there as well. I have over 100 articles on LinkedIn that are free. I would tell you, if you're interested in some of the high-level discussions that Samir and I had here, the Patreon blog you'll fall in love with it, because it's got a series in it called the Quantum Thermodynamic series that gets into why you need to know a lot more about electrons, protons, and light.
Mm-hmm. Great. Thank you so much for your time. I know you're a busy guy. You're actually headed to work now, right?
Correct.
Did you actually create your schedule so you have the daytime off so you can get sun exposure?
Yeah, I was out this morning at sunrise all the way until I talked to you. So I was out for 3 hours. Wow. And I was on the sun, on the levee here. Just so you guys know, it's 97 degrees here in New Orleans, even this early in the morning, and the UV index is already 16. So with that being said, for this hour, I'll be going, back outside going to work. I will have my sunroof open and my windows in my car down as I go to work. And when I go to lunch at 12 o'clock, I will be outside with my shirt off for that time. And I will leave work today at 4 o'clock and will be at my farm in a kaniki, which is a bathing suit that allows sunlight to go through it, but not much else on, from probably 4 to 8:30.
Wow.
That's how I do it.
So you definitely walk the walk. You're completely vested in everything you said today. So again,
I go back to being 360 pounds because, practicing neurosurgery and doing what I'm doing, especially on social media, it can put me big time at risk. I can easily backslide to what I was before, and I'm not willing to do that. I want to get the information out to people to let them know that they can do a lot to help themselves. Yeah, to learn the science, you're going to have to read a lot. A guy like you needs to read a lot, but guess what? The people out there with Crohn's and IBD, just be like the lion and the hippo. Just get your ass out in nature. If you do that, you'll be shocked at how well it works, and you'll just shake your head and go, I can't believe it was this simple.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you so much.
No problem. Take care. It was good talking with you.